Welcome to the Architectural History module in Semester 6 for Bachelors of Architecture. Today's lecture is on European urban planning, medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods. Compared to today, towns were scarce in medieval Europe, and those that did exist were very tiny. Medieval towns were usually smaller than those in the classical antiquity. In 1100 or 1200 AD, a town with 2,000 inhabitants was considered large. Only a few towns and cities in Europe had more than 10,000, and those with more than 50,000 were very rare. Even the city of Rome, the most important city of Western Europe, only had around 30,000. London, by far the largest city in England, is estimated to have 10,000 inhabitants in 1066, though 400 years later it probably nearly was 75,000. Population was never high in other English towns as well. York had a population of 8,000, whereas Lincoln 6,000. The biggest concentrations of large towns in medieval Europe were in the Flanders, that is modern day Belgium and Holland, and much more so in northern Italy. In these regions, and particularly in the latter, cities such as Milan, Florence, Genoa, Venice, or in the Low Countries like Bruges and Ghent, dominated the territory around them in a way which was unknown in the rest of Europe. As time went by and population of Europe increased, trade and industry expanded and new towns appeared. These often grew up where a powerful lord gave a village permission to have a market. The market attracted trade, trade attracted merchants, craftsmen and workers arrived, and soon a small town was emerging. Medieval cities were more of a size of a village. To the society, the medieval towns introduced two new classes: the bourgeoisie of merchants, introduction of bankers, capitalists, and industrialists, and the working classes of both skilled and unskilled laborers. With the introduction of these two new classes, the major part of the economic, social, and even political history of the West was dominated by the two. In their political effects, the towns may be said to have contributed to the emergence of absolute national monarchy. The kings relied on the middle class, that is, the bourgeoisie, and drew burghers with parliaments and state generals or courtiers. Economically, the medieval towns may be regarded as a transitional structure bridging the medieval with the modern economic systems. Medieval towns and cities formed into independent economic units with their respective customs barriers. It worked as an intermediate stage between the national economy of modern states and the medieval manner. Culturally speaking, development of towns and cities meant an acceleration of all the social processes of growth and change. New ideas followed the merchants and goods and traveled from town to town. The medieval urban status showed the following interrelationships. One was the economic, that was between market trade. Second was that of the social structure, that is craftsmen, clergy, and aristocracy. The third was the physical, being the town, public buildings, and fortifications. Fourth, that being of legal, districts on constitution. Fifth, the situation, that being the land and waterways. And the sixth being that of political vitality. The following factors have contributed to the urban development of medieval towns. First being that of feudalism, that was all land was held by the king directly or mediately and was the largest landowner. The second was revival of commerce. Affected by the Islamic invasion of the Mediterranean area, free trade was not possible, and that is why locally commerce was revived. Role of the church. Religion and church took over the imperial administration. District basis of ecclesiastical organizations was established, and it became the center of the city life. Walled city and burghs became fortified military and administrative center that promoted trade. In the 11th century, trade was that transformed Europe. Medieval industrial situation was that of fabrication of wool, coal, iron, agricultural implements that assisted in trade. The last factor being that of the common features of the urban form. Largely the same economic, political, and social context, except for Islamic Spain, the same kind of local vernacular buildings emerged. One having walls, that is some cases in a custom barrier, and a continent developed as a military requirement, for example, the concentric rings in Florence, or the ones in Paris that were built over a period of time. The second was that of streets. Several streets acted as markets. Entire medieval cities sometimes functioned as one. The street frontage was valuable, and paving was something that commenced in 1185 in Paris and 1235 in Florence. The upper floors kept projected on streets and formed the medieval city's scenes of informality and visual surprise. Rudimentary refusal systems was pension, but water supply was always an issue. The third aspect being of that of a marketplace, which generally occupied the center or was located at widening of the street. Planned town, as it were, per gridiron, surrounded by buildings of equal height. Unplanned towns, with number of cities alike, and often occupied main central position. The fourth aspect of the urban form was that of a church square. The church square was the last space before the church and generally on the western portal, and became the center of activities in the city. All the other residential quarters acted as vernacular fillers. In AD 395, Roman Empire was divided into two parts. With Constantinople at its capital, the Eastern Empire prospered, but the already disintegrating Western Empire under its capital Rome lasted only until the beginning of the 5th century. The whole West was invaded. Roman provinces were transferred into Germanic kingdoms. The Vandals were installed in Aquitaine and in Spain, Burgundians in the valley of Rhone, and Ostrogoths in Italy. Contrary to the popular misconception, the fall of the empire in the West did not immediately result in more or less complete breakdown of the Roman economic system. Although there was a continued commercial response for most of the Roman towns, the economic order of 5th to the 8th century, as it has always been founded on agriculture, remained. The role played by the church in maintaining the continuity of urban life in many parts of Western Europe is of prime importance. In general, the church had taken imperial administrative districts as the basics of its ecclesiastical organization, each diocese corresponding to a civitas. These districts were unaffected by setting up of the new Germanic kingdoms. These cities also retained trading functions varying from simple local produce markets to comparatively highly developed commercial activities. The tremendous effect the invasion of Islam had upon Western Europe is perhaps not fully understood. Out of it arose a new and unparalleled situation unlike anything before. Through the Phoenicians, Greeks, and finally the Romans, Western Europe had always received the cultural stamp of the East. It had lived, as it were, by the virtue of the Mediterranean. Now, for the first time, it was forced to live by its own resources. The center of gravity, therefore, on the shore of Mediterranean was shifted to the north. Commerce of any significance, and certainly of a kind that had previously supported professional international merchant bodies, was impossible in these unsettled conditions. However, a commercial revival took root and steadily gained the strength as soon as the political climate became only relatively more stable during the early decades of the 10th century. Throughout Western Europe, long-distance trading routes were reopened, notably those connecting Venice and North Italian trading communities, and by mid-century, Flanders had become comparable northwestern focus. The Church, which had preserved for Europe a semblance of civilized life during Dark Ages, not only provided the nuclei for many earlier medieval towns, but also a persuasive influence to restrain quick impulses which were all times so close to the surface. In addition of the protection afforded by bishops, walled cities, and strongly defended monasteries, numerous burghs established in all parts of Europe as heavily fortified military and administrative centers, which also served to promote the 10th century resurgence of trade. During the 12th and 13th centuries throughout Europe, feudalism was the basis of local government, of justice, of legislation, of army, and of all executive power. In this period, all land is held from the king, either mediately or directly. The king himself is the greatest landowner, and the estates are scattered over the length and breadth of the realm. Revenues of these supply him with a larger part of permanent income. The feudal system encouraged slightly but highly significant improvements in agricultural techniques, making an increase in the rural food surplus available to urban settlements with their steadily growing proportions of non agriculture specialities. In emerging towns, the inhabitants are also subject to a lord or king, but while some are only half emancipated communities of serfs, in other burghs have the status of small freeholders and in minority. But a growing minority of the case have established the right to deal collectively with the lord to be regarded as communes of free cities. This latter factor was to be profound importance of the rise of European urban society and corresponding decline of medieval feudalism. Two principal industries of medieval Europe were those of the production of wool and smelting work of irons. Timber, a most important raw material, was used both for general purpose construction and as a source for pure charcoal fuel required for the iron industry. Coal was widely used for domestic purposes. Neither the location of medieval towns nor their form was significantly affected by industry. The appalling conditions of roads, totally neglected since Roman departure, meant that that was only way of transporting bulk materials from any distance, which was by water. As a result, these heavy industries existed were decentralized on a largely rural basis in those districts where raw materials such as iron ore and timber were readily available. Production levels remained low until the end of the period, with demand increasing for small towns. They started to become industrialized urban centers. Long established boroughs with vested guild interest frequently reacted against the introduction of new techniques, thereby prejudicing the future techniques. Within towns, manufacturing villages, there would have been no separate industrial premise of any great size. Industry would have been of predominantly secondary nature, converting bar iron, for instance, into limited range of products, with the same premise, often serving as a workshop, shop, and a home for the proprietor. This characteristic European multiple use is a direct contrast to the separation of home and workplace, which is usually in the Islamic urban culture. Two types are common in both planned and organic growth towns of markets. First, where the market occupies a square to itself, normally located at or near the center, and second, where it is located at a widening of a main street. Two further types of marketplace in urban growth towns were as the lateral expansions of the main street and as squares at the town gate. In planned towns laid out with a regular gridiron structure, the market square is usual. Its general form here is that of a void within the grid, bounded by streets on all four sides. On the continent, it was usual for the surrounding buildings to be that of the same height, unified at ground level by arcades, under which streets frequently continued alongside the square. Although arcades would have suited the climate, they were not necessarily a tradition. Typically, most squares contain market halls, sometimes onto two floors, but instances of the town church facing into the marketplace are rare. The market street was much less frequently incorporated into planned towns and never into bastides, where it was characteristically ran along the length of town between gates. In unplanned towns, both the market square and the market street defy precise description. No two layouts were alike. Each had its own distinct spatial character. Many are still outstanding in Europe's cultural heritage. There are a few instances in Roman foundations of the markets occupying the site of the old forum area, but usually a central position resulted from an original location within the village from which the town had gradually developed. More often than not, the marketplace would be an irregular figure, sometimes triangular, sometimes many-sided or oval, curved, seemingly arbitrary in shape because of the needs of the surrounding buildings came first and determined the disposition of the open space. Several squares were shown around the market space. In addition to their commercial function, many squares were largely enough for public gathering. In towns that have evolved naturally from former villages or trading posts, the main thoroughfare automatically became market square since traffic is a vital element in the growth of a town. Marketplaces possibly developed as lateral extensions of main streets in order to free their activities from pedestrian and vehicular movement through the town. Corporate action would usually have been necessary to clear away existing buildings. Immediately inside the town gate was another logical place for trade to develop. There are five categories of towns in medieval Europe. First being that of the Roman origin, that retained their urban status during the Dark Ages but reduced in size and once deserted after the fall of empire but re-established on the original sites. The second category is that of burghs and boroughs, founded as fortified military bases, acquiring commercial functions later. The third category being of towns evolved originally from village settlements. Fourth being of the planned towns with full urban status. Bastides were founded in France, England, and Wales. And the fifth category of planted towns around Europe, generally planted in time with full urban status with or without a plan. The organic Roman town's origin was mostly converted to medieval towns. It had lost the gridiron structure over a period. Most of them were abandoned, were resettled using existing structures, advantage of location, and ready-made base for immigrants. Examples being of Lyon, York, and Chester. Within burghs and boroughs, walls were reinstated for Roman civic centers or monasteries turned into citadels. It was a defense against rival princes and invading forces, and mainly military and administrative towns, but attracted pre-urban settlements due to service industry for military. Examples of such being Nottingham and Southampton. In the village settlements, secondary function of local trading center or small-scale specialist industries took over. Examples being Warkworth, Blanchlet, Northumberland, Appleton-le-Moors in Yorkshire. Bastides were new urban with predetermined landforms. It had the gridiron system, it had a house plot with farming land, and was built by a royal central authority. Examples being that of Carcassonne and Kingston upon Hull. In the planted towns of the fifth category, Middle Age routes made towns after Industrial Revolution, and Revolution towns made routes. The essential prerequisite of that would be a waterway or a roadway. And the examples falling under this would be Salisbury, Delft, Haarlem, Santa Fe, Portsmouth, and Liverpool. Although no longer second in size to London among English cities, an eminence which York enjoyed from its Roman origins through late medieval times, the city is nevertheless still unrivaled in several aspects as a second northern capital. York alone of medieval town retains not only the full extent of her medieval walls, but also much of the close-grained, characteristically small-scale complexity of medieval urban form. York has a circuit of medieval walls beyond which at the late date there was still only beginnings of modern suburban growth. Within the walls, the old street pattern, where little has changed, and four main gateways of the Norman times control access to the city, as indeed they still largely do today. The main castle was at the confluence of Ouse and its minor tributary Foss, and the moat was later strengthened by stone-built tower, and the court was enclosed by country goals. The second minor castle was directly across the river and survives only as a rudimentary hill. The famous Shambles, the city's best surviving example of medieval streetscapes, is the unnamed lane between the pavement of northern end of the Church Street and the King's Square. After the reign of the Normans confirmed York as the northern capital after the initial local rebellion and built two moats and bailey castles to ensure their dominance. They also rebuilt the circuit of the stone wall. Not taking part into early industrial revolution, York has had a population increase by which date the railways were bringing belated suburban expansion. Some examples of burghs are as shown next. In some cases, the embryonic towns show how form of a future town would be largely determined by factors inherited from its rural past. The main form determinants of an organic growth in England and generally also throughout Western Europe were large land ownership or property boundaries and regional routes. Together with natural topographical constraints, these two man-made factors underlie the form of virtually all organic growth towns. Expansion of a village, or in turn of the town to become, was an incremental basis, field by field, if the land holdings were small enough, or as parts of larger fields. The unusually regular small scale field patterns would have been expected to determine an incrementally regular town. These sharply contrasted winding lanes of the road away across from the fields would, however, have been retained as one of the town's main streets. The example of Appleton Ley Moors in Yorkshire is a one with a street village with the bounding back lanes clearly delineated and with the long and narrow village land holdings also clearly shown in the image. Warkworth in Northumberland, a twin nucleus village dominated by its superb castle of Norman origin and with equally impressive church at the far end of the main village street, can be seen as shown in the image. Growth to urban status would in this instance have been greatly complicated by the location of the bend in the river. The example of Bastide is that of Carcassonne. There are two towns, the old original on the hilltop east of the river and the base on the lower ground across the river. Despite being heavily restored by Violet Leduc and others during the last century, the city exists as a unique example of medieval fortified town complete with two rows of ramparts, church and castle. The preservation is indirectly due to the action of Louis IX in expelling its inhabitants in 1240 and subsequently permitting them to found the new town across the river. From then on, the city was used mainly for military purposes. While the base city survived the destruction in 1355, it steadily grew in size and importance as the chief town of the departments, one of the very few bastides to have flourished to such an extent. A clear distinction must be made between the northern forms of settlements and those which became established in Islamic Spain. Whereas the usual European patterns are found in the north, with some Spanish modification in detail, the Islamic cities of the southern and central Spain are uniquely different cities of Western Europe. The characteristics are those of Eastern Arabian tradition in direct contrast to those of the Christian north. Toledo is one such example. The old city on its superb and naturally defended location in the bend of the river, requiring only the wall across the neck to make it one of the most impregnable cities of Europe. The enduring patterns of the streets and lanes is that of the Islamic city of the 8th to 11th century, which was unusual and that it comprised essentially the Medina as the complete city with only comparatively small suburbs on the northern side. During the Islamic occupation, Toledo became an exceedingly prosperous city, outstanding for its woolen and silk textile industries and manufacturing of the finest steel blades. In 1355, they suffered first of the several pogroms, culminating in the decree of expulsion. It lost its prosperity, which increased rapidly during the selection of Madrid in 1561 as the permanent royal capital. The street pattern typifies the Islamic combination of main radial routes leading more or less directly into the religious center and containing the residential quarters and their cul-de-sac access lanes. The two characteristically dominant buildings are the cathedral constructed from the early 13th century and the Alcazar reconstructed after the Civil War devastation when it was the main imperial residence. There was neither the space nor a sufficiently level area to create a formal plaza, and that role is performed by the irregularly triangular plaza, also constructed after the Civil War damage. Where the physical characteristics of settlement in the Netherlands differ from those of Western Europe generally, and indeed is still so with the reclamation of new land, is in not only the planning of an unusually large proportion of original villages, but also the subsequent extensions of many those that grew into towns. The only truly unplanned villages were those which were established on existing high ground, and the only organic growth consonant with Western European tradition was that which was possible before all available agricultural land had been taken up. Haarlem had its origin in the choice of by Counts of Holland of marginally higher ground enclosed within the bend of the river as the site of their residence, and occupied between the 11th to 13th century. The service town which established itself alongside the castle was defended by a ditch and cut across the river bend. The first extension was to the west and centered on a new market square, denoting its position on a dry ridge. A new wall and a moat was constructed, and districts were added across at the beginning of the 15th century, which allowed the extension of the new area west and south of the commercial canal. The Renaissance period in urban history is taken as extending from its commencement in Italy at the beginning of the 15th century until the end of the 18th century. The term Renaissance means literally rebirth, a revival of interest in the classical art forms of ancient Rome and Greece, and their use as inspiration in European painting, sculpture, architecture, and urbanism. Renaissance originated in Florence, where a particular social situation coincided with a particular nature of country and people and a particular historical tradition. The social situation is that of immensely rich and a powerful city-state in which leading families were active patrons of arts. For these wealthy merchants, the religious conventions of medievalism had little attraction. Furthermore, Italy had never taken to the essentially northern Gothic style of architecture. It was a country with innumerable impressive, if ruined, Roman ruins. It seemed inevitable that in the Florence, the clear, proud, and worldly spirit of Roman antiquity should be rediscovered. From Florence, the new architectural style quickly spread throughout Italy, and by the end of the 15th century, it had become firmly established in Rome. A key factor in the spread of Renaissance was the development of printing, which following seems was the main reason for reproducing books around 1450. In architecture and urbanism, two significant influences resulted from the discovery in about 1412 and printed publication in 1512 of the writings of Vitruvius, an architect practicing in the Rome of Augustus, and from the influx of Greek scholars and artists into Italy from Constantinople when it was captured by the Turks in 1453. At a time when architects were making detailed studies of surviving Roman buildings on which to base their designs, the De Architectura of Vitruvius had a mystical significance far beyond its real value of architects. The Renaissance coincided with marked increases in the extent and population of European cities. London's population grew from 50,000 in 1530 to 225,000 by early 1600s, although her boundaries were constrained until later on in that century. Berlin's population expanded fivefold between the mid-15th and early 17th century. Rome, probably presenting the most marked change, grew from an estimated 17,000 in the 1370s to about 124,000 by 1650. Yet this was still perhaps but one-tenth of her former maximum capacity. Mainly because of the size, there were few opportunities for comprehensive redevelopment. Destruction by fire, the greatest scourge of pre-19th century towns, or military action, as on the continent, seldom necessitated complete rebuilding, and when a chance presented itself, it happened after the 1666 fire of London. There was neither the political will to build to a new plan, nor the bureaucratic means to achieve such an end. Furthermore, there was no demand for new commercially oriented urban settlements. Europe generally was adequately and in part even over-provided with such towns. Only in the closing decades of Renaissance did industry become a significant generator of urban settlement. The relatively few new foundations of 15th to 18th century were therefore primarily either strategically medieval military-oriented origins. The only example is perhaps of St. Petersburg, where major city was founded during the Renaissance period, combines both origins. That of a military requirement and result of an autocratic rule. Renaissance urbanism was therefore directly limited either to the expansion of existing urban areas or to their redevelopment in part. Renaissance urban planning can be distinguished as fortification systems, regeneration of parts of cities by the creation of new public spaces and related streets, restructuring of existing cities by the construction of new main street systems, which extended as regional routes, frequently generated further growth, the addition of extensive new districts, normally for residential purposes, and the layout of a limited number of new towns. Renaissance urbanists had three major design components at their disposal. First, the primary street. Second, gridiron-based districts. And third, enclosed spaces such as squares, piazzas, and places. Since the Renaissance period flew seamlessly into the Baroque style, let us first understand the differences between the two. During the Renaissance period of urban history, the aesthetic determination of spatial design and that of the enveloping architecture was most closely integrated than any other time. One can explain the contrast to the Renaissance art, which sought permanence and repose in everything. The Baroque had, from the first, a definite sense of direction. Renaissance art is the art of calm and beauty. Its creations are perfect, they reveal nothing forced or inhibited, uneasy or agitated. Baroque aims at a different effect. It wants to carry us away with the force of its impact, immediate and overwhelming. Its impact on us is intended to be only momentarily, while that of the Renaissance is slower and quieter, but more enduring, making us want to linger forever in its presence. This momentary impact of Baroque is powerful, but soon leaves us with a certain sense of desolation. Throughout the Renaissance period, several dominant aesthetic considerations determined general attitudes to urbanization in all the countries. First, there was a preoccupation with symmetry, the organization of parts of planning program to make a balanced composition about one or more axial lines. This was sometimes carried to ridiculous extremes, as in the Piazza del Popolo in Rome. Secondly, the great importance was attached to the closing of vistas by careful placing of monumental buildings, obelisks, or suitably imposing statues at the end of long, straight streets. Third, individual buildings were integrated into a single coherent architectural ensemble, preferably through repetition of a basic elevational design. Fourth, perspective theory was one of the constituent facts in the history of art, unchallenged canon to which every artistic representation had to conform. The main components of Renaissance planning was the primary straight street, gridiron-based districts, and enclosed spaces as the residential space, the pedestrian space, and the traffic space. By the time that Renaissance attitudes and style had been firmly established, the new technique of printing enabled new design and theories to be communicated internationally. It was no longer necessary to turn ideas into buildings to demonstrate architectural intentions and to influence others. Urban designers of the Renaissance were presented for the first time in history with the possibilities of making their theories and experiences available to others on a wide scale. Italy had inherited from her imperial Rome past more towns than were needed, with the result that only two significant examples of new site planning were actually built. However, there are countless examples of military engineering theory applied to existing towns. From 15th century onwards, there was a succession of published works dealing with the theory of architecture, urban design, and military engineering. Let's take, for example, Piazza of St. Peter's at Rome. The great church of St. Peter's was built between 1506 and 1626, but it lacked an appropriate entrance forecourt until 1655 and 67, when Bernini carried out two major sections of a three-part piazza complex. These spaces are Piazza Retta, directly in front of the church, the Piazza Obliqua, enclosed by the semicircular colonnades, and the third section of Piazza Rustici, that has never been finally completed and is represented only in part by Mussolini's Avenue linking St. Peter's and the River Tiber. In preparing this layout, which was successful in competition with his leading contemporaries, Bernini had to incorporate the central obelisk erected by 1586 by Sixtus V and fountains built by Modena in 1613. The Vatican City encloses St. Peter's and extends east to the central line of the oval Piazza Obliqua. The River Tiber is some 655 yards further east from the bottom of the plan extract, reached along the Via Della, the avenue which performs in part the internal functions of the Bernini's Piazza Rustici. The scale of both the church and the space is vast, and the Piazza Retta in front of the eastern elevation is 410 feet wide, narrowing to 300 feet, where it adjoins the Piazza Obliqua, which is 320 feet deep. The Piazza Obliqua itself is not a true ellipse, but consists of two semicircular circles. From that which has been given in the earlier papal aggrandizement policy, one can assume that there was a formal axial approach leading into the piazza from the east. Hence passed the obelisk to the grand front of St. Peter's, whereas the 1830 map of Rome shows the piazza as a special island isolated from the Tiber and the city at large. Another example of Renaissance planning is Piazza del Popolo, which is situated on the northern side of the city between Tiber on the west and the steep slope of Monte Pincio on the east. The main approach road from the north to ancient Rome ran across this narrow area between the river and the hill. Built in the Aurelian Wall of AD 272, continuing straight on through the city, up to the northern slopes of the Capitol Hill. The Piazza del Popolo, immediately inside the gateway, was the main entrance place to the city, but little is known of its form during the ancient Roman and medieval periods. The redevelopment of Piazza del Popolo area was to make it a more impressive entrance to the city, which was started in 1560 under Leo X, with the construction of a new third road, but the piazza was not completed in its present form until 300 years later. The alignment of the new Via Bambino is such that it intersects with the line of Via Flaminia at the same angle and at the same point as the existing Via Ripetta. A grand granite obelisk was erected at this focal point in the center of the piazza. Earlier in 1586, Sixtus V had hoped to bring his piazza into the east again via Bambino, but this was prevented by the slopes of the mountain. The two twin-dome churches on the southern side of the piazza in angles formed by three streets were started in 1662 by the designs of Rinaldo and finished later by Bernini and Carlo Fontana. The other three sides of the piazza, completing its present form, were designed by French architect planner Valdier and date from 1860 to the 1820s. The city of Florence originated around about 200 BC when a new settlement was established across the Arno. It was named Florentia and received brief status as a municipium in 19 BC before it became completely destroyed in the Civil War of 82 BC. Florentia was rebuilt as a Roman colony a short distance downstream and the first sequence of defensive perimeters. Florence, for all its originating role during the early years of Renaissance, remained essentially a medieval city. Its magnificent Renaissance palazzi unrelated and in most instances uncomplemented by the suitable spatial settings. Of the city's two most important public spaces, one, the Piazza del Signora, the civic center for more than 600 years, is a medieval creation, its spatial anomalies only partially resolved by Renaissance furnishing. The Piazza Annunziata, on the other hand, is of a great significance as a work of Renaissance urbanism. Brunelleschi's Foundling Hospital in 1419 and 24 as completed presented its beautiful arcaded arched to the unresolved space in front of the church Annunziata, but it was to set pattern for the eventual enclosure of the piazza, a space which had the dual function of providing an entrance forecourt to the church and of terminating a long vista from the cathedral on the axis linking the cathedral with the state and the church. Following the construction of the Foundling Hospital, one bay entrance porch to the church in harmony with Brunelleschi's arcade was created. This porch was subsequently enlarged in 1601 into an entrance colonnade running to the length of the northwestern side of the square. A third arcaded side to the square facing the hospital was designed in 1516. These arcades served to unify a number of disparate buildings into one spatial unity in a manner reminiscent of the colonnades around the Forum at Pompeii. The arcade belonged to an individual building. In the Renaissance, arcades expanded the space of the square, integrating volume of structure and spatial void. Edmund Bacon, in an extremely important section of his Design of Cities, based his principle of the second man on the way the Renaissance planning of Florence was carried out. He stated that any really great work has within it seminal forces capable of influencing subsequent development around it, and often in ways unconceived by the creator. The great beauty and elegance found expression elsewhere in the piazza were not intended to be so. The crucial design to overcome this urge of self-expression and follow almost to the letter the design of the then 89-year-old building. The design set the form of piazzas and established in the Renaissance train of thought the concept of space created by several buildings designed in relations to one another. From this, the principle of second man can be formulated. It is the second man who determines whether the creation of the first man will be carried forward or destroyed. Venice, like the ancient city of Rome, has mythical foundation date. The site, an easily defended group of islands in the northwest corner of the Adriatic, must have attracted village settlement in 421. These islands on a lagoon were formed from sediment brought down by three ancient alpine rivers. Seeming deficiencies in the archipelago location were turned into advantage by the Venetians in controlling their city's growth. Individual islands were zoned for specific functions. Most of the islands gradually coalesced into a tight-knit group, traversed by the labyrinth canal system. But a rigid oligarchy government continued to differentiate between land uses. In the 20th century, Venice is no longer an island. It is linked to the mainland by rail causeway yards and completed by a motorway. Venice is connected to the Grand Canal, which is a unique waterway high street system. Venice is divided into 6 ancient segments, originally distinct islands, into the archipelago, but now unified into one continuous urban form. In addition to the main central piazza of San Marco, each district has its own local civic piazza. One of urban history's most memorable special ensembles is the Piazza San Marco. It consists of two linked piazzas, piazza proper in front of the Basilica of St. Mark and the piazzetta which connects it to the edge of the lagoon. The detached campanile of St. Mark's is located in the relatively narrow space between the two piazzas and acts as a perfectly positioned hinge. There is in addition a third small piazza along the northern side of the basilica. The site of this overall design was originally occupied by a marketplace lying outside the walls of the Venetian settlement. It began at the central focus of the city. During the early 15th century of the piazza was quite still small and its surrounds consisted of uneven brick facade houses. The present date character dates from 1480 onwards, which was built on the northern side. At this time, the campanile was rebuilt in brick in 1329 from its original of timber in 1888, was connected to the buildings on the southern side of the piazza. In redeveloping this side of the piazza and the western side of the piazzetta, the width of the spaces were increased, isolating the campanile as a freestanding vertical element. The western side of the piazzetta is formed by the library building. The final competition of the main piazza was not achieved until 1810 and was built across in its western side. The paving treatment, which constitutes a vital unifying element of design, was carried out in 1722, and the campanile collapsed in 1902, destroying a small portion, but both were successfully restored later. A multipurpose area in the front of the old basilica served both as the main market and the city's public meeting space. The campanile was attached to the main building in the southwest corner. Doge's palace was essentially a medieval castle in character, surrounded by the canals in form of a moat. The piazza in the early 16th century, before reconstruction of the southern side, had a new building line, thereby giving the campanile its freestanding location. By this date, the piazza occupied the final area on the western end and was completed only in 1810. Several minor squares and pedestrian routes between the piazza of St. Mark and the Accademia Bridge on the northern side of the Grand Canal are shown connected here. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.